June DeHart, Vice Chair of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems Board of Directors. Welcome to this, our virtual U.S. election program 2020. We have so many issues that we will be discussing. How do we cultivate youth participation? How do we vote safely during a pandemic? Cyber threats, fake news, mail-in balloting. All of these are issues that we will tackle during this program as the American electoral cycle concludes. And as we look toward important upcoming elections around the world in places like Kenya, Nicaragua, and Myanmar. Sadly, it has been reported that a majority of countries, for the first time in over 2 decades, could be characterized as autocracies. This from the VDEM 2020 Democracy Report. And of course, the pandemic has created opportunities for mischief, for would-be authoritarians taking hold of government institutions and of threatening human rights protections. It's a complicated time and no easy solutions. But we are a resilient, passionate, and creative community of poll workers, activists, thought leaders, public servants, and citizens who want to make and care about making democracy work day to day, year to year, election to election. It is our responsibility to ensure that every voice has a vote. And as I look at the list of participants and speakers for this program, I'm impressed and I'm encouraged that democracy is in good hands. We have lots to do to ensure that elections all over the world are trusted, secure, and accessible for all. So let's get started. Stay safe and well, and thank you for participating in this program. Enjoy U.S. Election Program 2020. Thank you.
My name is Tad Devine, and I'm co-chair of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems Board of Directors. I am honored to join IFES Vice Chair June DeHart in welcoming you to the virtual United States Election Program 2020. Vice Chair DeHart is a member of the Republican Party. I am a Democrat. In our own ways, we have each worked hard to advance the values, policies, and candidates of our respective parties. Although we hold, at times, different political views, we unite at IFES to fulfill democracy's promise for all people. This election cycle, many democratic norms are being called into question. We find ourselves tested by global pandemic, economic uncertainty, social unrest, disinformation, and citizen disillusionment. These challenges are not unique to America. Democracy all over the globe is under exceptional strain in what has been an exceptional year. But none of us would be here working hard to advance credible elections, accountable governance, and inclusive democracy if we didn't believe in our institutions. We are gathering at the virtual USEP 2020 to discuss democracy, not as a relic of the past, but for the promise that it holds for how we live our lives today and for bringing about a better future. June spoke of our community, of the people like you who make the choice each day to ensure everyone has the right to have a say in how they are governed. I am proud to be part of this community and to share this journey with you. Thank you, and enjoy the USEP.
The International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. And I am proud to open IFES's virtual U.S. Elections Program 2020. Thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome all of you who are participating today, and especially IFES partners working in countries around the world. I'm also extremely pleased to recognize Microsoft as the champion sponsor of IFES's U.S. election program. Microsoft's innovative Defending Democracy program does such important work to safeguard democratic processes globally from cyber-enabled threats. We are grateful for their partnership, and you will hear a moving message from Microsoft President Brad Smith later this morning. As you just heard from our board vice chair, June DeHart, the pandemic has created or exacerbated complex challenges with no easy solutions. But as our board co-chair Tad Devine observed, we are all adapting, and no one faster than election managers in the US and around the world. Today, we will hear an outstanding series of experts and practitioners speak to these challenges and adaptations in the context of the US elections. We will also take a virtual visit to a couple US polling stations to see firsthand how the election is unfolding. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Rushdie Nakruddin, IFES Regional Director for Africa, who will share the ground rules for today's sessions. Rushdie, over to you.
Welcome to all of you joining us from around the world for the virtual US Elections Program 2020. We've taken great care to bring diverse perspectives throughout the USEP from both sides of the political aisle, from inside and outside Washington, D.C., and across generations, genders, affiliations, abilities, and identities. Diversity, inclusion, equality, and justice are essential to our pursuit of vibrant democracies. We strive to treat everyone with dignity, decency, and respect, and are committed to providing a safe space for people to express their views and engage in discussions about elections and democracy. When you RSVP'd for the event, you accepted the USEP 2020 Code of Conduct, which enables discussion without discrimination and without fear, intimidation, or threat of reprisal. We will be upholding these principles throughout the program. You'll find the Code of Conduct on the virtual USEP website lobby, along with a link to our accessibility page and information about how to get live interpretation. You can choose from one of 6 languages and closed captions in English at the bottom of your screen. If you prefer to listen in Arabic or Bahasa Indonesia and do not see these options, then you will need to update your Zoom. It's free. You'll find a link for this on the USEP website and in the chat. Our global IFES family works hard to build democracies that deliver for all. Our work around the world is made possible by the American people through the US aid and other donors. The content of USEP 2020 does not reflect the views of US aid or our program sponsors, nor do the opinions herein reflect the views or opinions of IFES. Today, we have an exciting program that explores the unique features of the US electoral process, its strengths and vulnerabilities, the variable experiences of voters around the country, and the campaign strategies that each side has brought to a highly polarized yet energized electorate and an election impacted by COVID-19. While we will not be taking live questions today, if you leave a question in the question and answer section, we'll do our best to follow up with an answer after the USEP has concluded. However, our moderators will be asking you some questions. We're very interested in hearing from you. While you are watching, we encourage you to engage with us in discussion in the chat here and via social media using the hashtag USEP2020. We will be live tweeting from our handle at IFES1987 this morning, tomorrow on US Election Day, and the morning after the US Elections Program on Wednesday. With that, let's proceed to our first discussion on American elections, its strengths and vulnerabilities. It's my distinct pleasure to hand over now to Erika Shein, Director of IFES' Center for Applied Research and Learning and lead editor of the IFES COVID-19 briefing series. Over to you, Erika.
Thank you, Rushdie. Hello all and welcome. I'm Erika Shein. We will be focusing in on this session on what makes the US electoral process unique and uniquely flawed. As of Saturday evening, more than 91 million American voters had already cast their ballots for the office of the president, both houses of Congress, and thousands of state and local offices. As many of you know, this election season has been fraught with discord and division, highly litigated and much debated. But the US election system also has some sources of strength. We have a great deal to learn from each of our discussants, who I am delighted to introduce now. Pippa Norris is lecturer in comparative politics at Harvard University and the founding director of the Electoral Integrity Project. She has published nearly 50 books on politics and democracy. Franita Tolson is vice dean and professor of law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Her new book, In Congress We Trust: Enforcing Voting Rights from the Founding to the Jim Crow Era, will be published next year. And finally, Trevor Potter is the founder and president of Campaign Legal Center. He was general counsel to John McCain's 2000 and 2008 presidential campaigns, and he's former Republican chairman of the Federal Election Commission, the independent regulatory agency charged with enforcing federal campaign finance laws. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'd like to begin our session by posing the same question to both Franita and Trevor. In your view, what are some of the most important strengths of the US electoral system? Are there features of the system that you think are most resilient against democratic erosion or backsliding? Franita, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning and also with my co-panelists. So I do think that our biggest strength are the voters. The voters continue to show up in even when the system fails them. And in this season in particular, I am impressed with the people who are willing to stand in line 8, 9, 10 hours in order to cast a ballot. It tells us that despite everything, despite the fact that this election has been fraught with litigation, despite efforts by states to make voting harder in the middle of a global pandemic, voters still showed up, and they were able to, in some cases, overcome the barriers that were put in front of them. And so in my view, they continue to be the strength of our system. And the quicker we realize that, that means the quicker we can address some of the weaknesses of our system. So in terms of, I don't know if you want me to go into the weaknesses right now, but I'm happy to do so.
We're going to stick with some strengths at the start,
okay,
and then we'll get into all of those. Thank you, Franita.
Okay.
Trevor, over to you. What are your thoughts on the biggest strengths of our system?
I think the biggest strength this year has been flexibility. We are, as I think everyone watching knows, a very decentralized system. Unlike most modern democracies, we do not have a central election commission that runs the election. The election is not run by the national government. That can be confusing because it means that you have 50 different variations of where you vote, exactly how you vote, when the votes are counted, when the absentee ballots must be received, depending on the state law. But I think the advantage has been that it has been relatively possible this year for many states to change their rules quite quickly to deal with the pandemic. So we're a country where some states, 5 of them, have voted for the last couple elections essentially by mail, voting from home, though there has been an option for people who didn't want to go into a polling place. But those states, Oregon, Washington, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii, so Western states, have voted by mail, and other states are adopting that this year because they realized at a time of a pandemic, either it might be dangerous to be crowded in polling places, or that the polling places might not be able to open if workers were ill. And so, as you pointed out, we have had a huge number of voters already voting before Election Day. What is undoubtedly more than half the electorate has voted before Election Day. And that is because of the flexibility we've had in spreading out the votes. And that does mean that on Election Day, there will be far fewer people going into the polling places that are open around the country. So I think that decentralization and the ability to therefore respond to changed circumstances is certainly a plus. And I would add to that, I think, the very hard work of election officials around the country. Each Secretary of State in the state is responsible for working with state officials, legislature, their courts, to try to make an election happen in the middle of a pandemic. And they have really worked hard. And I think it's pretty remarkable that the more than half the voters who have voted so far appear to have done so pretty smoothly without any real trouble.
Thank you, Trevor. It's great that you brought up the decentralization of the election process. And Pippa, I'd like to turn to you, given all of your global comparative experience. I'm curious if you think that decentralization is sort of a strength of the American system or a vulnerability or some combination of both. For sure, it sets the US apart from most other countries in the world. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be helpful for our audience.
Well, thank you, Erica, and good morning. And I very much agree with Trevor that decentralization is both a strength and a weakness. It does allow flexibility, but it also means that there's a mishmash of different laws and regulations and procedures. Simple things like what time the polls open or how to register or whether you need voter identification. So that is a complex environment. Combine that also with partisanship. So many of the electoral officials are essentially elected from the parties, and then we also have the state houses determining the laws. So decentralization and partisanship allows local errors, sometimes accidental errors, but it's difficult to correct them. And of course, you're also putting the fox in charge of the henhouse when partisan officials have an incentive to change the laws just slightly in order to benefit their party. And then you also have the other weaknesses, things like a winner-take-all system, which heightens the incentives to make sure that your party is going to win, because otherwise you lose very much, very strongly. Problems of, for example, the Electoral College, which means that rural areas are somewhat overrepresented, problems of extreme gerrymandering. And so the US has a very long-established electoral system, but it really hasn't been reformed in a radical way across the whole country to bring up modern standards. And many of the people in this, listening to this, I'm sure, will have come from countries where the systems have been reformed in major ways through transitions or international assistance, so that there are things like a national election body, there are things like independent boundary commissions, and there are things like standards across the whole country. And I think America could actually learn from the experience which IFES has pulled together, but of course of many other countries as well. Some of these initiatives are things that we should think about, and perhaps there'll be opportunities. A crisis in an election, and I think we all agree that this is a crisis in many ways, is also an opportunity for change. Think back to the progressives in America and the radical shifts. Think back to Watergate. And whenever the American system is under severe challenges, people have come through and said, okay, now's the time to really think about serious reforms, how we can learn from other countries, how we can improve the system.
Thanks, Pippa. That's helpful. And one of these kind of serious issues that has come up a lot, obviously, in this election season has been voting rights. So, Franita, I'd love to turn to you here and ask you what you view as the most serious threats to voting rights in the U.S. electoral process. For our international audience, do you see a gap between what's in the law and what happens in practice for American voters?
Absolutely. So I do think that the way that elections are run here in the United States is probably very different from elections around the world. For example, as Pippa points out, some countries having to produce identification in order to vote is pretty standard. Whereas here, because of partisanship, voter ID laws in particular have been a challenge in some places where voters have difficulty getting the identification because they can't afford the underlying documents, for example. So I think it taps into this larger problem where you have regulations that are legal, right? So voters are required to register, voters are required in many places to show identification in order to cast a ballot. Voters are required to do a number of things in order to successfully vote. But sometimes those things can be disenfranchised and depending on who the regulation has a disproportionate impact on. And so partisans often take advantage of the fact that people of color in particular are disadvantaged in many ways in order to make voting more difficult for that demographic. And so there tends to be a gap between sort of our rhetoric, right? We hold ourselves out as as the best democracy in the world. Yet in some places, it's very difficult for voters to cast a ballot. I think you saw a lot of that with this election season where there's been so much litigation over the rules in the context of the global pandemic, right? And whether or not states have an obligation to make it easier to vote. So for example, a lot of states, as Trevor points out, were aggressive in trying to relax their rules given the COVID-19 pandemic. But other places, particularly those states that are battleground states, it's been very, very difficult for voters to find that they can vote with the same ease as voters do in places where the election won't be as contested. And so in many ways, the decentralization does have its benefits, but it also, in some ways, produces more burdens on voters, particularly voters who live in areas where the election is more contested. The two major candidates are polling more closely together. And so these voters are burdened because voting is often made more difficult as opposed to making it easier.
Thank you, Franita. I think that's a really helpful overview for our audience. There is one area where we do have some centralization, and since we have Trevor here with us today, who has a lot of expertise, I'd like to probe on that a little bit. In a 2016 speech, Trevor, you noted that Americans have a tradition of growing impatient and angry at a government we think is not listening to us or acting in our interest. So you identified the lack of a fair campaign finance system is the main weakness in the US system contributing to this frustration. I'm curious, 4 years on, if you still see this as the primary vulnerability. And if you do, what would it take to really address this issue?
I apologize. I think it's clearly one of the areas that we need improvement in. I agree with Franita and Pippa that there are definitely others, and dealing with the partisanship issue, having sort of minimum federal standards for the right to vote. We can have a decentralized system, but still be in a position of ensuring that certain basic minimums are met in terms of citizens' access to the ballot. It's clearly wrong to have some states trying effectively to make it difficult to vote because they think the majority in their legislature thinks it's in their interest to make it harder. That is not appropriate for a democracy. But in terms of the campaign finance, money, and politics side, we do have a federal election commission that is responsible for full disclosure of money spent in politics and policing the limits on what candidates and parties can receive from individuals to prevent corruption. Unfortunately, over the last 10, 15 years after the passage of the McCain-Feingold reform bill in the early 2000s, our system has been weakened, some by Supreme Court decisions allowing unlimited corporate spending and effectively unlimited independent spending on the theory that it would be truly independent of candidates. And that has not been paired with any kind of enforcement effort to ensure that the spending is independent of candidates. So we now routinely speak of the Trump super PAC, or we see super PACs outside spending groups that are supposed to be wholly independent of candidates that have been created by the candidate's family or their head of their finance committee. And the candidate is meeting with donors, thanking them for giving, making it clear that they will have access if the candidate is elected. So that's one problem. The lack of transparency for some of this spending is another. The Supreme Court, in saying that there could be unlimited corporate spending, said, but not to worry because it will be fully disclosed and voters will know who is speaking to them and shareholders will know how their money is being spent. But spenders quickly found a way around that by giving to groups that do not register and report their donors. And then those groups would spend the money. That should have been stopped by the Federal Election Commission. I believe it violates existing law, but it has not been, partly because the FEC is a 6-person commission with effectively 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and it takes 4 votes to take any action. And it hasn't had 4 votes. It has deadlocked on every major issue for the last 10 years. Right now, it is not deadlocking, and that's because it doesn't have a quorum, so it can't even meet, which is a failure of the Trump administration to nominate bipartisan commissioners from both parties. They're now proposing to do so after the election when it will matter less. So all of these are what I would call process problems. They can be dealt with. There is a bill in the House that passed in the last session, and that Speaker Pelosi has said, if she's still the speaker, will be her first priority in the new one, which would reform the Federal Election Commission, and require more transparency and put some teeth into the requirements of the courts that this so-called independent spending, which has swollen in size, is truly independent of candidates and parties to prevent what would obviously otherwise be and is, I think, significant potential for corruption.
Thank you, Trevor. That's very helpful. I'd like to turn to you, Pippa. In your 2018 book on electoral integrity in America, you characterize the challenges in the US in the electoral process as a set of trade-offs between voter inclusion and security. 2 years on, and the day before, of course, the 2020 general election. Which way do you think the pendulum has swung? Has the US found the right balance?
So this is a critical issue, which clearly is heightening tensions in the elections. On the one hand, the Republicans, I think, have a genuine fear that there are issues of fraud and security. As we've said, many other countries do have some form of free voter identification. Think about a place like India, where everybody can get a photo ID, and then that's actually on the polling place sheets as well, so people can see the photo against the names. In America, we haven't had that. And by contrast, of course, there are many, many stories of voter suppression, where there have been attempts to limit access to the polls. Examples where, for example, certain changes under COVID have been introduced by the local areas or by the state, and those have been seen as challenged. There's over 300 challenges right now in the courts, and that's confusing again for voters because they don't know exactly how they can vote if the conditions change. They don't know whether their vote can count, and that therefore undermines trust. So there is a trade-off between, on the one hand, security, which is critical. We all want to make sure that everybody's vote counts. People don't vote more than once, and that there's security, for example, against foreign hacking. On the other hand, there are also real issues, particularly for communities of color who are unfairly discriminated against through, for example, limiting where polling places can be or where ballots can be cast. So I think we need to create a balance. And the unfortunate problem, Erica, of course, is that party polarization has so increased, and there's a lack of trust on both sides on these issues. So I think we need to be innovative. And again, I think this crisis provides new opportunities. We've had commissions in the past which have looked at this, particularly under Obama. I think we might need to move towards more public engagement. For example, a citizens' assembly is a way which many other countries have thought about changing particular things where the parties can't agree, but we know that there's an issue. And if we can have some sort of compromise, both to allow free voter identification to every citizen who's qualified on the register, so that we know that that's effective. There aren't limits on those who have to buy some sort of access card. We also improve voting conditions to make sure, again, that there are easy ways for people to vote. So the challenges we've talked about for certain communities aren't faced. Then some sort of compromise might be able to be achieved. And the great thing about a citizen's assembly, it takes it out of the hands of the politicians and the parties, and maybe allows some sort of other form of flexible compromise. For example, in Ireland, such a device has been used to think about issues of abortion, and very successfully, they changed their law as a result. In British Columbia, they looked into this to try to change their electoral system. So I think we need to be creative and imaginative and flexible about how we can actually improve both sides to come to some sort of compromise.
Great, thank you, Pippa. That's helpful, and I'd like to kind of follow on that and pose a question to Franita that's related. We've seen lately that there's just a lot of disparate interests across the political spectrum that are really mobilizing to try and keep the peace and preserve trust in the US elections. And there's also been a lot of very intense reform discussion across topics in the election community in the US. Do you think any of this is going to stick or gain traction in the coming years? What do you see as most promising coming out of this election, a potential change?
So I do think it'll stick. That's actually my hope. My fear is not so much of what will happen tomorrow. It's more so about the lessons that we'll learn from this entire experience. A lot of people, both people who do politics for a living, professors, commentators, and everyday Americans have a lot of anxiety about this election. And so I hope that it drives the conversation for reform, and that when we wake up on Wednesday, if we or Thursday or Friday, or whenever we know who the next president is, that we don't immediately turn the page and start focusing on the elections 2 years out or 4 years out or whatever, that we actually stop and take a moment and think about long-term change so that we don't bring our democracy to the edge of the precipice and, and court disaster every time we have an election. So I do think it'll stick. And in terms of changes that I think we can do, there are some options on the table. So, for example, there's a bill in the House right now where it mandates independent commissions to redistrict federal elections. It addresses the some of the campaign finance issues that Trevor raised. It will re-enfranchise people who have felony convictions for purposes of voting in federal elections. I think that, that bill has a lot of promise. There's also a bill to reauthorize a portion of the Voting Rights Act that was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. So it would require certain jurisdictions that have engaged in discriminatory behavior to pre-clear any changes to their laws with the federal government, their election laws with the federal government prior to those changes going into effect. That law also has a lot of potential to protect the right to vote and to protect voters if it is reenacted. So there are things on the table that we can do. And to be clear, though, these are conversations taking place. I just hope that after this election, there's the momentum to actually get some of this done. And given the stress and anxiety of this current moment, I think that momentum will be there.
Thanks, Franita. And for our international audience, I'd love to talk just a little bit more about the Voting Rights Act, which was, a watershed civil rights and voting rights legislation. And we do have a really great IFES original whiteboard on the subject that we will be sharing during this program this week. But I was wondering if you could just, for the benefit of the audience, just talk a little bit about the case that overturned key pieces of the Voting Rights Act and what might be in potential new legislation.
Of course, Erica. So the Voting Rights Act, I think your audience should understand how significant it was. It was passed in 1965, and it really did have the effect of remaking the American electorate. So for almost a century, African Americans in the South in particular have faced significant discrimination in voting. And so the Voting Rights Act was a way to help ensure that demographic can cast a ballot. So the provision at issue before the Supreme Court in 2013 in a case called Shelby County versus Holder was the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. So the preclearance provisions required those jurisdictions, particularly those with the worst records on voting rights, to preclear any changes to their laws, their election laws with the federal government. So it had the effect of suspending their ability to pass laws that would have the effect or purpose of disenfranchising African Americans without federal oversight. And so by virtue of that provision, African Americans were able to register to vote in record numbers throughout the South in the 1960s and 1970s. And so not only did it change the complexion of the electorate, more African Americans and Latinos and other groups that have had difficulties were able to run for office, were able to, for the first time in generations, become significant portions of state legislatures, and they were really able to increase their political representation. The problem is that in recent decades, Congress had failed to update the coverage formula, i.e. those jurisdictions that had the obligation of pre-clearing any changes to their laws. And so essentially the law became outdated, according to the Supreme Court, in a way that didn't justify the intrusion on state sovereignty, right? This asking states to check with the federal government before they can change their law. The Supreme Court viewed that as a requirement that had to be justified, and Congress had failed to meet that threshold. So they invalidated that portion of the law.
Thank you, Franita, for that useful discussion about that. Sticking with this sort of vein, we're seeing an increasing number of elections around the world that are involving or even ending in the court system. And to an observer, it seems like the US election this year has been incredibly highly litigated. Trevor, is this a new phenomenon? Are we just seeing it more in the press? Or, are we imagining that there's more of it this year? And then kind of related to that, are there any trends or patterns you're seeing in how the courts are ruling and the impact it's likely to have on the election?
That's a great question, because it is clear we are seeing a vastly larger number of cases this year than we have ever seen before in the run-up to an election. Normally, there are a few cases dealing with people who have been taken off the voter rolls, or perhaps the change or or closing of some polling locations, issues like that. But this year we've had over 300 cases across the country in the courts. Now, those cases are designed to clarify the rules before the election in the time of COVID. So I would say most of them have related to making it easier to vote at a time when citizens were nervous about going into crowded polling places, and to do so by allowing citizens to vote absentee, meaning from home by mail. And some states, as I explained, already do that. Many others traditionally have not. And so they were being pushed, often in these lawsuits, to change their rules this year and allow people to vote from home in advance of Election Day without any excuse, without having to say, I'm too sick to leave my house, or I'm going to be out of state on business, which was traditionally what it took to get an absentee ballot in states that required some sort of reason to vote early. So many of these suits have been over that, and then over the process by which people vote absentee to make it easy, because there are states that said, well, you can vote absentee, but you have to have 2 witnesses sign your signature, or a notary public. And again, in a time of the COVID pandemic, having 2 strangers around in your house to watch you vote and sign your ballot envelope is contrary to what most people are trying to do in terms of staying isolated. Or finding a notary public is almost impossible because they don't want to see people. So those are the sorts of reasons that we've had a number of suits. I will say, and this goes to the point that Pippa made earlier, there has been what I find as a very distressing partisan battleground here in these suits, which is that, led by President Trump, the Republican Party position this year has become, we don't want people to vote absentee. We don't want to make it easier to vote. And that has led to examples all across the country where the suit is being filed by a Republican group or legislator or entity to prevent the improvement in the election system that has been done by state officials. So in Texas, the governor has prevented more than 1 location per county where people can drop off ballots. There's a suit now by Republicans in Texas trying to invalidate 100,000 ballots that were cast early at a voting center on the basis that that voting center wasn't authorized. In other states, you have seen suits to require witnesses when the state had agreed not to have them. And President Trump has been questioning the safety and security of absentee ballots, even though the Republican Party traditionally in previous elections has relied heavily on soliciting absentee ballots from its voters to try to get those ballots in ahead of the election and give them a leg up in ensuring that voters have in fact voted. So I think there are more suits than we've ever seen before. They have had a more partisan tinge with, loosely speaking, Democrats pushing to make it easier to vote and Republicans pushing to make it harder. And on top of that, you have had this split in the US Supreme Court, because many of these cases are brought in state court under state law, but some of them are brought in federal court alleging a violation of federal law, either the Voting Rights Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was a case in Alabama where a disabled voter wanted to be able to vote from his car because he couldn't get up and go into the polling place. And the issue was, could local communities allow that if they chose? And the federal court said they could under the Americans with Disabilities Act, a federal law. And then the US Supreme Court stepped in and reversed that. Now, they did so saying that in their view, the majority of the court, there was a very strong dissent by the liberal minority, but the majority said generally elections should be run by states, federal courts should defer to the states, and should not intervene and change the rules. So there is this split where the US Supreme Court is telling federal courts not to intervene and make it easier to vote. And there may yet be another constitutional issue coming up where some of the justices on the US Supreme Court think that the deference due to the state is only to the state legislature and the law it has passed, and that there should be no deference to state Supreme Courts and state election officials. And so that's I think, a serious dispute that will arise and perhaps be resolved after the election. So there's a lot going on the legal side. Some of it is quite novel to us, this argument that the federal courts must defer only to state legislatures and not state Supreme Courts. That's not the position so far of the majority of the Supreme Court, but it is a pretty radical position and would significantly change how federal courts reviewed and enforced the right to vote at the state level.
Thanks, Trevor. I think this discussion really highlights what we were talking about a little bit earlier about how unusual, unique the US system is relative to most of the rest of the world. So on that, Pippa, you've led a really innovative and very data-rich global research initiative since 2012, your Electoral Integrity project. And you do surveys of experts after elections around the world and elections in the US. So a couple questions on that. One, is there anything else that hasn't been highlighted yet that comes out from your survey data as very uniquely American, whether it's a strength or a vulnerability? And then another question as well is, you're going to run this survey again soon after tomorrow's elections. Do you expect to see anything different from in the past?
So those are really good questions. The Electoral Integrity Project was founded now 8 years ago, and we really wanted to look at elections around the world because elections have been spreading, but clearly the standards are very variable. And we've focused also on established democracies. For example, we've looked at the flaws in many other countries, like in the United Kingdom, which have had problems about registration, or in Australia, or in Canada, or in many European countries. So America is not alone in this, as I'm sure, again, the audience is very familiar. These are challenges which exist in many different countries. The problem with the United States, in many ways, is that the Constitution is so old. The institutions have been quite rigidified. It's quite difficult to change them. And therefore, you need a shock to the system to really produce a radical reform. So will this happen in this election? I think it's worth thinking about 3 different scenarios which might occur. Firstly, if the outcome of tomorrow's election is a clear Democratic landslide. And so right now, Biden is ahead in the popular vote, and the projections, such as they're worth, the forecasts say Biden is probably going to get in with about 450 Electoral College votes, which is comfortable. It's more than any court or any particular state appeal could overturn. If that happens, it's quite likely that we'll see some changes, and hopefully we'll be able to learn about some of the other innovations around the world to import them into the United States. Second outcome, however, is what I term Florida on steroids. And in many ways, this is these are the issues which Trevor has referred to, which is increased litigation. Started, of course, with Bush v. Gore in 2000. It's not new, but has really been increasing over successive elections and is now reaching a climax. It's a particular problem when the Supreme Court is seen as not legitimate by some because it's now heavily Republican. And so that's the second option, which might well happen if the election is close, if particular states like Pennsylvania have real challenges in the local areas, and there are strong legal appeals, and if everything hinges on a much closer election. And the third scenario, of course, is that there's a clear victory for the Republicans. And again, that's an outside chance, but the polls have always been wrong. We all remember 2016, and it's possible. In which case, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have a continuation of some of the issues that we've seen in this election of voter suppression. And that's going to get worse because, of course, the president and the administration has talked about problems of electoral fraud which don't actually exist from the best evidence that we have, and has highlighted mistrust in the electoral system, along with mistrust in the media as a source of information, along with spreading misinformation. So there are many, many issues there. So Is the United States going to improve and reform and cover some of those challenges? It really does depend on the outcome, which of course right now is unknown, but we'll all be watching very much in the next few days or even longer to see what the outcome will be, and therefore whether the electoral system can be changed in a more democratic manner with a small d.
Thank you. One of the things you just mentioned was misinformation. So I'd like to talk about that for a little bit. Franita, I know you have some experience working with social media platform on how to understand and recognize the kind of misinformation that would function effectively to suppress voting, and how to counter that. So I was wondering if you could tell our audience a little bit about that experience and the strategies you found to sort of stop misinformation on social media, to stop the voter suppression. And do you think that we might be better prepared in this regard for future elections, or how could we be better prepared?
I do think we're better prepared this time around. So 2016 was an election in which you did see a lot of misinformation. And I don't necessarily think social media was equipped to address it because it was just such a new phenomenon, the amount and volume of misinformation that manifested across platforms. I've been working with Facebook to try to figure out ways to better identify suppressive content. And it's been a great experience in a sense of being able to help them understand how misinformation and voter suppression is heavily contextual. So there are situations in which certain information might not be suppressive for one voter who lives in, for example, New York, but it's totally suppressive for a voter who lives in Mississippi because our voting rules vary by state. It was also an opportunity to explain how voter suppression has changed historically. We often think about disenfranchisement issues as involving outright attempts to keep someone from voting. So if, for example, a state has rules that prevent people of color from casting ballots explicitly, or if you have, in America in particular, a lot of people are familiar with the civil rights movement and the efforts by African Americans to regain their voting rights, and they have these mental images of the police and white supremacists and people of that sort trying to keep voters from the polls. And so when we think about disenfranchisement and suppression, it's often with this narrative of bad actors trying to keep people, actively trying to keep people from voting. Well, voter suppression has evolved, and efforts to suppress the vote are not always so obvious. And so one of the ways that platforms like Facebook have tried to address this is by countering it with correct information, right? Putting the information at the hands of the voter to try to figure out how to register, to try to figure out where their polling place location is, to try to figure out what they need in order to cast a ballot. And so that's been a way that Facebook in particular, through their Voter Information Center, has tried to counter misinformation by giving voters the tools that they need in order to figure out how to successfully cast a ballot. And so it's been a really great project because I do think that this particular election cycle has been one in which there is still a lot of misinformation. There's still a lot of efforts to suppress the vote. So giving voters the information they need and the tools in order to get, in order for them to figure out what they need to do has been especially effective, I think. Facebook has registered somewhere in the helped 4.4 million voters register to vote this cycle, which is huge. And this is not something that was possible in 2016. So great progress.
Yeah, thanks for that insight, Franita. Trevor, do you think that our campaign finance and our media laws, our legal framework essentially for the elections in the US, is actually prepared for the challenges posed by social media, by online campaigning? Can we sort of apply some of our existing laws to that, or do we need some reform?
I think we clearly need some reforms because the basis of our existing laws that applies to radio ads, television ads, newspaper ads, and so forth, is the disclosure of who the speaker is, who is spending the money for the communication. And there is no such legal requirement for social media, and whether it is the paid advertising or the other ways in which people communicate on social media if they're being paid to do so. And that doesn't exist. We haven't updated the laws since the arrival of the internet. Some of the larger social media companies like Facebook have put policies in place to give us some level of disclosure. But we really don't have the same requirements for social media that we do for more traditional broadcast media. So that side of it is a problem. But parallel to that is the secret money, what the press calls dark money, that we see being spent in our elections. And that is being spent through social media. And what that means is that even if Facebook requires the disclosure of the source of the paid advertising, if that source is a group called Americans for a Better Country, and there is no visibility into who that is or how they are funded, it is then possible basically to avoid the disclosure rules, even as voluntarily imposed by those companies. And one worry for us is the possibility that the money that is being hidden is either foreign money, so from somebody trying to influence this country and voters from overseas, or special interest money that is trying to get something out of the government and doesn't want anyone to know who they're trying to elect to do that. And again, the Supreme Court has said that voters are entitled to that information, but it's important to know who is speaking and what their perspective and biases and goals are. And so I do think that we need to make changes in the regulatory structure to ensure transparency and, under our laws, to prevent foreign money from being spent to influence US elections.
Thanks, Trevor. We've heard from the lawyers. Pippa, I'd like to ask you a question about the political scientist community. Obviously, we've seen in recent elections the phenomena, which is becoming less and less exceptional, of a presidential candidate losing the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College. And I'm curious if you and the political scientist community think that this is going to become more common due to demographic shifts or the number of House seats being capped overall, and therefore the districts or the Electoral College votes, and how political scientists are seeing this play out in the future.
So, great question. Most countries don't have an electoral college. So it's this little known institution, which has been left over from the constitution. And it's essentially that most people think that the popular vote, whoever gets the largest number, will win the White House. But of course, it doesn't work that way. The problem with the electoral college is it really was designed to overrepresent rural areas. At the time, that made a lot of sense. But nowadays, it does mean that when there's a big division between parties in who's voting in large urban areas, New York, San Francisco, LA, and those who are voting in the rural heartland of America, when that cleavage is there in the parties, that kind of overcompensation of rural areas makes a big difference to the outcome. So we've had essentially elections in 2016 where Hillary Clinton, as we know, won eventually 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. But of course, Donald Trump won those key states in the areas of Wisconsin, Michigan, and so on, which allowed him to enter the White House. That disparity is one which, of course, means people question the legitimacy of whoever wins. It could go the other way, potentially, that, in other words, the Democrats could win potentially the Electoral College and not the popular vote, although that's unlikely. So this is an area which really needs some reform, particularly when there's low levels of trust in the electoral system and in politics in general. Again, about 10 years ago, before we had so many controversies, about 50% of the public in America said they trusted the honesty of their electoral system. They were asked this in Gallup polls on a regular basis. Nowadays, that figure has gone down to about a third. It went down a lot, particularly in 2016, and it's likely to be, we'll have to look at what happens after this election. But given the tensions and the passions and the ways in which things are playing out, it looks like it might go down even further. And if people don't trust their electoral system, they don't think it's fair, they don't think the adjudication process is one which would allow all parties to win. And if they don't see that the party with the largest share of the vote actually can enter the White House or the Senate, where again there's a rural bias, then there are fundamental questions. And it does raise passions and questions about how people are going to respond to the election result. We've seen tremendous energies in the public, and that's a wonderful sign. Turnout is likely to be higher than ever before. Civic engagement, political interest is high. That again is really positive. The downside is where people feel that they've lost, but they've lost not because their side has lost in terms of the popularity, or they've lost the campaign, or they've lost the arguments, or they've lost the issues. They feel that they've lost because of the rules of the game. And that's where we might well see some sort of protest, which start off peacefully, but may end up in some sort of violence. And of course, that's a fundamental challenge that, again, many other countries have seen. We find about a fifth of all elections around the world end up with some sort of violence after the election. America has had violence in its past. We can think back, for example, to the 1960s and the riots. We can think back earlier to other cases where there's been fundamental civil discourse. We hope that won't occur after this election, but it's on the cards. And it's also on the cards because people are getting their information from different sources. And so each side can claim that the election was unfair for different reasons. And people in both the Democratic and Republican Party, whoever loses, might well feel that they need to challenge the results and challenge the way that we get to the results, challenge the processes, challenging the procedures, challenge the court rulings. And that, of course, is a very dark prospect indeed if it occurs. And we've already seen some incidents of violence in Michigan, for example, with the governor, in the role of the militia or white supremacist groups, and violent protests on the other side as well. So we'll have to see how all of this plays out in the next few days, and whether people peacefully protest, which is perfect, fine, whether they use the courts and litigate, which seems highly likely, or whether in fact they also resort to incidents of violence in places around the country.
Thank you, Pippa. This is a good bookend for our discussion. And in our last few minutes, I'd like to turn to Franita and Trevor. If you could just in a minute or so, just really tell for us of the challenges facing the electoral process in 2020. What do you see as the most worrisome? And if you can, how could this challenge be addressed before future elections? Franita.
So I think Pippa did a really terrific job of sort of pointing out, the red flags going into this election. And I just want to echo that. We're in the middle of a legitimacy crisis. The rhetoric around our election about, the election being rigged, allegations of fraud despite evidence to the contrary, I think it has done a number on people's faith in the system. And the only way that American elections work is for people to believe in the system. So even if we are able to emerge from this process with a president elected, we have a lot of work to do to rebuild confidence in our elections, because the election officials, the everyday people who are working the polls, who are running our system of elections, I think for the most part, they just want to facilitate this process in a way that people can cast ballots and their voices are heard. But the rhetoric of, people who are elected to state legislatures, people who are officials in our political parties has really undermined the faith in the system to some extent. And so we're going to have to work on that. But closely connected to that, and I'll hurry up and wrap up, is this we have to be more aggressive about addressing the structural weaknesses in our system of elections. The Electoral College is one of them, right? So this disconnect between the popular vote and the winner of the Electoral College also undermines faith in our system in a way that is completely counterproductive. If there's a split tomorrow, that will be the third time in 5 election cycles where the popular vote winner and Electoral College winner are 2 different people. And that is not good for a country that holds itself out as a democracy.
Thanks, Franita. And Trevor, if you have just 30 seconds, last thoughts on this, please go ahead.
I think both Franita and Pippa have done a very good job of highlighting one of the central challenges we have, which is we were not created over 200 years ago with an electoral college as part of a democratic election for president. The electoral college was instead of a direct election for president. We have ended up today in a situation where we have 2 parallel systems. Sometimes they reach the same result, and recently they haven't been. There seems to be a broad assumption that whatever happens in this election, Biden will get more votes than Trump. And normally in a democracy, that means that person is the winner. But That's not how it will work if the Electoral College comes out differently. And I think there is underlying where we are a tension between the democracy majoritarian approach and the approach we have in our Electoral College, which structurally is simply different and prioritizes less populated states. That's a older, not a modern democratic system. And running the two together, I think, presents a real challenge for this country and something we're, I hope, going to be able to address.
Thank you, Trevor. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone from around the world for joining us, and to our panelists for giving us such a thoughtful window into their work. Please stay tuned now for a call to action by Microsoft CEO Brad Smith to work together to safeguard the health and resilience of our democracies. And after that, we'll see an IFES original whiteboard video on election administration in the United States. Thank you so much for watching.
Hi, I'm Microsoft President Brad Smith, and I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining the IFES U.S. election program. I think we've come together because we all appreciate there is an urgent problem that we need to work together to help solve. The rise of those who are trying to undermine democracy creates an urgent call to action. It's a call to action for all of us who care about the long-term survival and the health of democracy itself. The democracies of the world need to work together. We need to work together in new and innovative ways to build election resilience, to counter foreign influence campaigns, and to build capacity to strengthen the very fabric of democracy. At Microsoft, we believe that technology companies have a responsibility to help protect our democratic processes, to protect our democratic institutions. It's why we partner with organizations like IFES that do important work to further this critical mission. It's also why in early 2018, Microsoft created the Defending Democracy program. It's a program that focuses on helping to safeguard democratic processes globally from cyber-enabled threats. Since then, we've seen cyber threats grow. But we've also seen in the last 2 years the Defending Democracy program grow as well. We've grown by working with governments and civil society, with political campaigns and parties, working with industry partners to protect elections around the world. Working together, we've delivered programs and training in more than 30 democracies, programs and training that help protect the integrity of elections, help protect political campaigns against hacking, and work to advance tools and policies that help defend against disinformation. I just have to say, we are so grateful to IFES, so grateful for the work being done to provide an opportunity to connect with this important global community, because it's so clear that we will stand or fail together. And that's true today for the virtual U.S. elections program. If you'd like to learn more about our work and how we might be able to help in your region, reach out to IFES so that we can connect you with our team. We look forward to supporting you as you work to defend your own democracies at home. We look forward to working together, not just this month, not just this year, but in the decade and decades ahead. I think we always have to remember, at its heart, democracy is both precious and fragile. For most of humanity's existence, it has been the exception, not the rule. Democracy will flourish only as long as we work together to protect it. We are committed. I know you are too. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to work with you.
Election administration in the United States. Early U.S. elections were straightforward, infrequent events. But as the country grew, elections became much more complex. In most countries, national elections are run by one centralized commission, ensuring a more consistent experience for voters. In the U.S., thousands of local election managers plan operations for their jurisdictions, which range from fewer than 100 voters to nearly 7 million. The constitutional quirk that created this mosaic is the Elections Clause. It says that states run their own elections, but Congress can step in when needed. A national law, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, created the Election Assistance Commission. This body provides guidance to state administrators but does not manage elections nationally. Each jurisdiction relies on their respective state laws, rules, and funding to decide how voters are registered, ballots are cast, and votes are counted. For some voters, the experience is simple and straightforward. For others, it's fraught with hurdles. Some voters register at government offices, others online or by mail. Voter registration deadlines vary from a month before the election to Election Day itself. In more than half the states, voters must show identification to vote. As free voter IDs are not universally available, some contend it's a burden on elderly, minority, and low-income groups, dampening their participation in elections. Casting ballots is another issue. Many voters cast their ballot on a computer. The technology may be new or more than a decade old and obsolete. Some voters are given paper ballots or vote by mail. In most states, the chief election officer, usually an elected Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor, supervises the election. Responsibilities include overseeing voter registration, centralizing voter records, and generally making the voting experience more uniform within each state, with some guidance from the EAC. Other states have an appointed commission or shared responsibility for these tasks. In some cases, the chief election officer oversees his or her own election or resolves conflicts involving his or her political party. This can be seen as a conflict of interest. This was highlighted in Georgia's 2018 election, where the Secretary of State was responsible for election oversight and also a candidate for governor. His office's attempts to purge voter registries, close voting precincts, and reject some absentee ballots were considered highly controversial. Opponents alleged he was using his official position to benefit his candidacy and party. He claimed to be enforcing election guidelines, not as a politician, but as a public official. To address this issue in some states, conflict of interest laws have been proposed. For example, some states have resign to run laws requiring certain officials to leave office before running for election. Over time, the election process has become increasingly complex and often more difficult for voters. Researchers are finding this is one factor reducing public trust in U.S. elections.